What a pleasure to be joined now by Nick McCarvel, who I have known along the way, covering all kinds of different things, most specifically tennis. But you are a Swiss Army knife. I mean, you've covered a
Yeah.
number of different sports and really have a focus on what's going on as we march towards the French Open. Thank you so much for taking a couple minutes to preview the tournament.
Yeah, Carolyn, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
You too. So for those who are kind of on the outside looking in, who might not be familiar with some of the other players on the men's side, obviously the headline of not having Rafa Nadal in this tournament is what everybody's kind of talking about heading in. What overall impact do you think his absence will have on the French Open?
Yeah, pretty huge, Carolyn. I mean, that's been the headline the last week. Rafa announcing not only that he's missing his first French Open since 2004, but that he's not going to play tennis again. He doesn't think until 2024. He actually said last week in a press conference at his academy that he thinks 2024 is probably his last season. So in terms of the French Open, would Rafa have been one of the favorites should he have played? That's tough to say. He hasn't played since January. He didn't play any of the clay season. He physically doesn't seem to be 100%. I mean, that's quite clear. But when you look at the men, to me, three names really jump out. Carlos Alcaraz is now the world number one. He won the US Open last year, has broken through really as the next big player on tour. Novak Djokovic is a two-time champion, obviously, at the French Open. He's got 22 slams. He's trying to one-up Rafa and join Serena in the the Open era 23 mark at Majors 1. And then Daniil Medvedev. He's had a great run this season, 5 titles. He's won 39 matches, and he won his first big clay title in Rome. So those are the three boys I'm looking to make a deep run in Paris.
And out of those three, even though Djokovic is the one that we're all sort of most familiar with, is Alcaraz best poised on this surface, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, Alcaraz is poised, it feels like, at any surface. Put him on a block of ice and he just figures out a way to, he's a really great fighter. But yeah, he has shown his clay chops. He won in Barcelona as well as Madrid, and maybe a little bit of a trip up last week. He lost to a player named Fabian Marozsan, who's not even ranked inside the top 100 in Rome. That was unusual to see Alcaraz lose to a player that low ranked, but I actually think, Caroline, that might help him in his French Open preparations, just get his mind, his body right. But you can't look past Djokovic. The French Open was the last of the 4 majors that he claimed back in 2016. And he's just someone that can hit through the court. He makes it so frustrating. So those two guys, surface-wise, I think Djokovic and Alcaraz, yes.
How is Djokovic playing right now, in your opinion, coming off a recent loss as well, right? I mean, is there anything that you see in terms of weakness in his game coming into this major?
Exactly right. He has not had the traction on clay that he's wanted coming in. He's 5-3. He lost to Holger Rune, who's another up-and-coming player we should watch out for, the Danish who just turned 20, the Danish player. And Djokovic, the scary thing is these champions, they always level up when they need to. So Djokovic, only 5-3, I say, did not win a clay title leading into Roland Garros itself. But again, I don't necessarily put a lot of stock into that because he's just proven time and time again that he can deliver when it counts.
Outside of those three, is there anybody on the fringe that you think could maybe not win it, but make a deeper run or surprise us? Is there anybody that's playing better over the last month that you think might give it a run?
Sure. I just mentioned Holger Rune, who I think is, if you follow tennis at all, he's got quite the personality. He does not back down from the big boys. There's been some salt, and you could throw in some pepper there in the way that he plays. Last year, actually, he had a really testy encounter with Casper Ruud, who is a runner-up to Nadal in last year's final. So I'd watch out for Rune. Jannik Sinner is the Italian player. He's always dangerous. And in terms of Americans, both Tommy Paul and Francis Tiafoe, they've proved that they can play on clay too.
Yeah, it's an interesting time on the men's side with all of these players who, in theory, could show up on a big stage and sort of have their moment. I guess just to punctuate it on the men's side, what we've seen from Rafael Nadal over the last couple of seasons could really only be described, well, you could describe it probably 1,000 ways more eloquently than me, but I mean, superhuman is what comes to mind just because of the way that his body has continued to break down. And then similar to Novak Djokovic, to your point, they get on these big stages and it's like they forget that their bodies are failing them or that they have lost a couple of matches coming into the tournament. They just show up in a way that seems improbable and remarkable. How would you sort of describe or encapsulate what we have seen from Rafa Nadal through these recent stretch of injuries where he has continued to show up and win?
Yeah, I mean, it is superhuman. It's out of this world. Pick whatever galactic sort of a comparison you want for Rafa and on clay, but also last year, coming through and winning the Australian Open and then winning the French and actually making the semifinals of Wimbledon. This time last year, Rafael Nadal, he was 2 match wins away from sweeping the first 3 majors of the year. So like you say, he's managed many injuries. Right now, it's the hip. In the past, it's been the knees. Last year at Wimbledon, he had to withdraw against Nick Kyrgios with an abdominal injury, but he really has pushed himself. And sometimes Rafa doesn't get the credit for being, just a dang good tennis player. He's great at the sport because of the way that he competes. Just like you say, the fact that he is able to push his body, push his mind, push his heart on, that's what people appreciate about Rafa. And I think there's certainly that hope that in 2024, he's going to give us that one last glimpse of it too.
And it's funny because in some ways this feels like a tired storyline because we really truly have been saying goodbye, it feels like, to these titans that have been on the Mount Rushmore on the men's and women's side for so long. And yet we don't want to say goodbye. So we still feel torn. And it is a big deal to kind of hear it finally coming from Rafa's mouth that he's not going to play to infinity and beyond. I mean, are there stars on the men's side, Alcaraz included, and some of these young players that are really fun to watch that you think will eventually step into this spotlight and offer just a small piece of what tennis has seen over the last decade plus with the big three? Or is this a true void that the sport is going to feel for quite some time? I mean, Novak Djokovic is still in the mix, of course, but I mean, just thinking about the macro story with how those three have dominated, are there players ready to step into these shoes?
Yeah, it feels like there is, and actually Novak said last week in Rome that he feels like the next generation has arrived. And even before we chatted today, I looked at the top 20 in the world right now. Only Novak and Rafa are over the age of 30. So this next generation, there's kind of this idea in tennis that there's a lost generation. You think of Grigor Dimitrov, Kei Nishikori, Marin Cilic won the US Open in 2014, but that generation really wasn't able to challenge the big three, like you say. So Alcaraz, to me, he's world number one. He's already won a Grand Slam. And then we look at the likes of Felix Auger-Aliassime, the Canadian. I mentioned Holger Rune as well as Jannik Sinner. Casper Ruud, he made the French Open final last year. And there's really dynamic and exciting kind of rivalries that are building as well. Nick Kyrgios, he hasn't played much tennis. Alexander Zverev, he's the Olympic champion. We haven't seen him much because of an injury. But, can you fill a void that has been built for 2 decades by some of the best players ever, Carolyn? I think that's really tough to do right away. But I do think we have players who see what it takes to be at that level and be at that level consistently. And I think, yes, that they're willing to step into that spotlight. Are they able? That's why it's sport, and that's why they go out there and compete.
Yeah, it's well said. On the women's side, Iga Swiatek is a force to be reckoned with, but who else do you see on the women's side? And is it more wide open than some people might think, with Iga sort of at the top?
Yeah, I do think it's Iga's tournament to take. She's a 2-time champion. She's the defending champion. She has stepped into that world. She doesn't get enough credit for the way that she stepped into that world number 1 ranking when Ash Barty retired in March of 2022. And it's really been Iga's WTA tour since then, winning 2 slams, being world number 1, taking on all this pressure. And she's done it methodically. She's this very curious character who likes to read. She's very private. She's quiet. But when you go into the spotlight of being world number 1, all eyes are on you. Every spotlight is on you. 2 players for me that I look to really challenge her, Carolyn, are the Australian Open finalists. The champion in Aryna Sabalenka, she won the title. She beat Swiatek in Madrid. And then Elena Rybakina, she won Wimbledon last year, lost in the Australian Open. What a great match that was against Sabalenka. But Rybakina, she hasn't really been a player we've talked about a lot on red clay, nor has Sabalenka been. But both of them winning Madrid for Sabalenka, and for Rybakina, it was Rome. She also beat Swiatek, who had a little bit of an injury in their quarterfinal. And that's maybe the lingering question mark for me overall is Swiatek fit? And then how does she hasn't successfully defended a Grand Slam title, but those are the three players on the women's side I'm really watching out for.
How do you sort of dismantle her game? Or if you are Sabalenka or Rybakina, what is the approach with a player like Iga to at least try to have a chance, assuming she is fit?
Yeah, I think sometimes Iga can come out and can be in her head a little bit. When she's firing on every cylinder, she's proved it, the world #1 woman right now on the WTA tour and on the globe. I think it's about taking away time. You look at Sabalenka and you look at Rybakina and they're hard. And so from a pure strategy perspective, it's about taking away time. Now at the French Open, we play on red clay. It's the only major that we do so. So if it's heavy conditions, I haven't looked at the forecast in Paris. If you're looking at a cooler French Open where it might be damp, some of that Parisian spring rain, that's going to help Swiatek. But if you've got a hot couple weeks in Paris where the conditions are hot and the clay gets bouncier, that's really going to help players like Sabalenka, like Rybakina, and some of the other big hitters on tour to be able to hit through the court more.
And any other players on the women's side that you're thinking about, again, that might not threaten to win the title, but that could make it to the quarters or the semis or kind of get out of that first week that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think there's so many actually in women's tennis right now. And actually, those are my three favorites, but I think it's almost double digits in terms of the women that can win this title. You look at last year's finalist, Coco Gauff. She hasn't had a sparkling clay season yet this year. Maybe that will help her in the lead up to the French Open. Ons Jabeur, she loves red clay. She crashed out in the first round last year. She's been dealing with some injuries. But you've also got players who have been deep at slams before, like Maria Sakkari. She had match points to get to the final here in 2021, as well as Caroline Garcia. She has exploded back into the top five. She was a top five player 6 years ago, Carolyn, and now she's back inside the top five. She did that in the summer season leading into last year's US Open. And Garcia, the French hope around, can a French woman, we haven't seen any singles player since Mary Pierce hoist the title for the home crowd. I think Garcia's got the game to go deep too.
It's an incredible amount of pressure to be playing for your native sort of country with the expectations on your shoulders. From what you've observed, what sort of makes the French Open unique outside of the red clay at Roland Garros that so much has been made about? How does the crowd sort of participate in this particular major? Will you get a sense that there is a little bit of that hometown favoritism for a player like Garcia if she is in the mix? I've never been to Roland Garros. What does it feel like to be there? What makes this major unique?
Oh, it's a wonderful major. Roland Garros is quite the iconic venue. They've made huge improvements, including putting a roof on Court Philippe Chatrier just in the last few years. Now they have a night session. That's been a little bit controversial. But in terms of the players themselves, there's a lot of pressure on the French players. This is a national event that people pay attention to Roland Garros for those 2 weeks. And they haven't been able to in the last 20 years. You look at Amelie Mauresmo, she oftentimes fought against that pressure at home, but players like Gael Monfils, Jo-Wilfried Tsonga, Richard Gasquet on the men's side, they weren't able to deliver a French Open win or even a final. And now you look at Caroline Garcia, she'd really be your chief among the favorites on the women's side this year. It's an occasion. The Parisian brass are out. It is national news. Obviously, it's an international event. It's also kind of tucked in this sort of sleepy corner of Paris, which makes it all that more charming. But the French players historically, and I don't mean this as a slight, but it has been a place where they just haven't been able to deliver at their home slam. Can Garcia turn that script, flip it for her better? I'd sure love to see that, especially because she sort of realized a new way in her career in the last 12 months.
That's excellent insight. And just one other topic before I let you go. I do want to get your thoughts on the latest that we can expect around the doping allegations in Simona Halep. Now, multiple accusations being sort of alleged at her, and she maintains her innocence and says that basically this is a result of contamination. What are the steps forward here, and what should we know about this story? I mean, it without asking you to editorialize, because obviously there's a lot that we don't know, just a lot of people defending her, including herself. She says that she's innocent. What should we know about this?
Yeah, I think the big news in the last week is that there has been, you said allegations. There's been a second allegation now, and that's been leveled by the ITIA, which is the agency that is in charge with overseeing doping and betting, actually, and the legalities around tennis. And that has come from what they say is irregularities in her biological passport. So every athlete, when you get doping, a test, no matter if it's 10 years ago or 10 months ago, it goes into your biological passport and they keep those samples. So once she got the first doping offense, or once she was accused of initially last September after the US Open, they then went into her passport and looked into try to find irregularities or find anything. And ITIA has come out just in the last week and said, we have found irregularities. Now, Halep has said she's pushed for a quick resolution to the initial offense, but the ITA is now saying, well, wait, we need more time to gather our case, but to also there's an independent tribunal that will hear both of these allegations. And so the ITIA has said, we need a little bit more time, Simona. And she's saying, you're saying one thing publicly and you're slowing down the process privately. Listen, it's a terrible situation for any athlete to go through. It's been 9 months now from that initial allegation, obviously the initial doping offense or the allegation around that. And you feel for Simona Halep in the situation, but it has to play out. The tribunal will hear this case, and it has to be close and insufferable for Halep, who has maintained her innocence and said she never knowingly ingested any banned substances.
And she's seeming to sort of intimate here that the longer this process takes, to your point, I mean, it needs to be played out for a number of different reasons on the timeline that they need. The longer that it takes, the more detrimental it is to her brand, the way that she's viewed. I mean, if these allegations are sort of drawn out, then all of a sudden it's weeks upon weeks of being described as a quote unquote doper.
Right.
From what you've gathered about the tennis community, and I think this is probably, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe the most high profile example of this that we've seen since everything with Maria Sharapova, if her name is cleared, is the tennis community in a place where you sort of forgive and move on, or does this already leave, in your opinion, sort of a stain that will never maybe be fully removed?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. And I had my analyst hat on there for most of our chat today, but you have to put your human hat on too, and remember that these are people, these are individuals. So I can't imagine how that feels for Simona, but I also look at the integrity around sport. And obviously we've seen doping across Olympic sports. We've seen it in many different venues, and cheating is cheating. And so these systems are in place. Are the systems perfect? Honestly, I'm not an expert on how all of those play out. I do understand that they found these irregularities. They have to go back in now and present that case. So obviously that takes more time. And of course, Halep wants things to move quicker. That is her right to feel that way. But as things stand, this is the system in which it works. And hopefully that they can, move to that tribunal hearing sooner than later.
All right, I want to get 2 picks from you if I could put you on the spot before I let you go. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but who do you think is going to win the men's and women's title at Roland Garros?
Oh, my favorite part. I love making picks. Let's go Carlos Alcaraz. Let's see him deliver on the clay in Rafa's absence, the young Spaniard. And you know what? The pressure is on her, but I think that Iga Swiatek actually could defend her title. So I don't know if I'm going out of any sort of safe picks there, picking the 2 world number ones, but with everything swirled around the French Open, I think those are some bold picks.
You know what? I was going to go chalk and pick those 2 as well. I just didn't want to say it for you.
Let's go.
Yes. Nick McCarvel, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it. Enjoyed the tournament. And for those watching, you can find Nick just about anywhere. I love some of the pieces that you've written for Racket Magazine, our friend Caitlin Thompson's publication. You truly are really all over the sport. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.